All right, well, we're going to take a look now at the aggregate supply side of our model. This is a little bit more complicated because, as you'll see, there are actually two aggregate supply curves, one for the short run and one for the long run. It's the two curves that help us to bring everything back together from where we started. When we started talking about the business cycle, we have these ups and downs in the business cycle. Well, what we're going to see is that those ups and downs really reflect the short run part of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So the ups and downs are the short run curve. The trend over time is the long run curve. So as we get a handle on what those two things mean in the context of our model, we're going to be able to use this model to help us understand the short run ups and downs that we're experiencing today, and hopefully where we should expect to go in the long run. So let's put those two pieces, develop those two pieces, those two aggregate supply curves, and then we'll get to really what this model is useful for, and that is helping us to understand the short run and the long run changes that occur in an economy, as well as what happens to our three major pieces of the macroeconomy. What happens to output, what happens to unemployment, and what happens to price levels. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at aggregate supply. And the thing about aggregate supply is that there are actually two different aggregate supply curves. We're going to be using aggregate supply as a way to illustrate what goes on in the short run and in the long run. So real quickly, back to our business cycle model. We had these ups and downs over time, and GDP is increasing and decreasing and increasing and decreasing. We go through these cycles. We have our peak or trough, our peak recession trough recovery, peak recession trough recovery. And we said also about this that there was a trend through that cycle of ups and downs. And the trend is what happens over the long run. And the ups and downs are what we see during the short run. So the business cycle itself is the short run, the kind of day-to-day stuff, the month-to-month stuff. But the long run, over time, we hope to see things increasing. And we should expect that because that tends to be the pattern that we observe. Now, taking that information of the business cycle and kind of transforming it into aggregate supply, really what we're looking at is a short-run aggregate supply which reflects the short-run ups and downs of the business cycle. So it's these ups and downs that are what we experience on a regular basis. And so the short run is going to reflect that. The long run, on the other hand, represents that trend line, that hopefully perpetual upward moving GDP over time. The long run is unique in this analysis because it is representing a condition in the macroeconomy that we call full employment. Full employment, or sometimes this is referred to as the natural rate. So it's the natural rate of unemployment. So what this means is there's going to be some amount of unemployment. It's the natural condition of the economy. And even though not everybody who wants a job has a job, we're going to call that full employment. Now, again, this goes back to one of the things we talked about at the intro of macro. Remember, this isn't a bad thing. There will be some unemployment because of those two types of unemployment, the frictional and the structural unemployment that are just natural in the economy. So we have these two types of unemployment. They form the natural amount of unemployment. So there is a little bit, and that's okay. But at the long run, our economy will always and only be producing an amount of output that is consistent with the natural rate. There's one other thing about these conditions, these short run and long run conditions, that I want to mention before we actually take a look at a picture of these two things. And that has to do with prices. In the short run, and this is really the distinguishing feature of the short run, in the short run, not all prices adjust to changes in the macroeconomy. Not all prices adjust to changes in the macroeconomy in the short run. We'll see what that looks like shortly, but that's going to become really, really important for us as we make this distinction between the short and the long run. In the long run, all prices adjust to any change because there's enough time for them to adjust. So all price levels adjust to changes. And as a result of that, it brings the macroeconomy into equilibrium. So in the long run, everything's really quite stable. In the short run, there's more fluctuation. There's more of that up and down. And we would expect the long run to be more stable because it is the trend. So with that background, let's take a look at what a long run curve looks like. I'm going to start off with long run because it's a little bit easier to deal with and a little bit more straightforward. So here is our setup. Along the horizontal axis we have GDP, and along the vertical axis we have price level. The long run aggregate supply curve looks like this. It's just a vertical line straight up and down. We'll label it here LRAS for long run aggregate supply. And at this point here, where it hits the horizontal or the GDP axis, what we have is the natural rate of output. This is the rate of output that the economy is going to gravitate towards naturally in equilibrium because all prices have adjusted. At the natural rate of output, we have the full employment level of GDP. And as I mentioned on the last slide, this is the natural rate of unemployment as well. So this is the natural rate of output. It's the output that the economy will go to when it is in equilibrium. We labeled this point, or we would label this point with a Y with a little asterisk beside it. Y is, don't ask me why, but Y is the economist shorthand for GDP, or output. So we call this Y star, and Y star is equal to small letter U star, and that U star is the natural rate of unemployment. So this is what long run aggregate supply looks like. And there really isn't much more to talk about in terms of the graph. The curve can move, but it's not going to move a lot. It's going to take a long time for it to move. But what I do want to mention about kind of the position of the curves is to notice that that amount of output, that natural rate of output, it's not based on any price level. It's not based on any price level because it doesn't matter what the price level is. Look here, if this is our price level, we'll call that PL for P low. Well, we're on the natural rate of output. We're on that long run aggregate supply curve, and so our output is the same whether price is low or whether price is high. We produce the same amount of output. Price doesn't matter in the long run. We can have high prices, we can have low prices, but the long run aggregate supply curve isn't going to determine the price level. The long run aggregate supply curve only tells us what the natural rate of output is. The reason why prices really don't matter here in the long run is that all prices adjust to make sure that the economy is producing Y star, or that natural rate of output. Because we have enough time to adjust to any change, all prices adjust so that production occurs at that natural rate of output Y star. So the only thing we really have to worry about with long run aggregate supply at this point is what causes that curve to shift? Why might that long run aggregate supply curve not stay at that specific natural rate of output? And the answer is something we're going to get into a lot more in the next chapter. If the long run aggregate supply curve shifts, it means there is growth happening. Remember, we measured economic growth as the change in GDP, and change in real GDP per person over time. Well, now we're actually showing what that looks like. As the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, it means there's growth. Now, hopefully the growth is positive, but the growth could conceivably be negative. So what are some of the things that cause that curve to shift? Well, we're going to talk more about these things in the next chapter, but I just want to give you a short list of them here. These are the things basically that cause economic growth. One of them, and probably the oldest way of thinking about economic growth, was to have a change in resources. If you want to produce more things, you're going to need more inputs or more resources, more land, labor, capital, in order to produce those things. So this is, think back to your early history classes where you're learning about explorers going out to find new supplies of gold or spices or whatever they're looking for. Really, what that is an attempt to do on the part of those explorers is to curry favor with the crown, make themselves rich, but also bring more resources back to the mother country so that they can produce more things. And this is still true today. We still need more resources to produce things. We just don't go about it in the same way as the old explorers did, and that's probably good for everybody. But a change in the number of resources. Now, this would also include people. So if you want to have more economic growth, one of the things that economists talk about is you need people. You need people with ideas. You need people who are able to do jobs and able to create things. Additionally, we might talk about human capital changes, so improvements to individuals through education, through skills training, those kinds of things. So just a change in the quantity and the quality of resources would be something that would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. And of course, if your resources go away, if somebody comes and steals them, or if your population moves out of the country, we talk about something called a brain drain. Where the smart people, the capable people leave a country and go somewhere else where there are better opportunities. That would also shift the long-run aggregate supply curve, but not in the direction that we want it to. A second shifter would be a change in technology. And so really, we can think about technology in a number of different ways. We could think about it in terms of having the internet or having really smartphones or just kind of the bells and whistles and the gadgetry that goes along with technology. But we could also think about technology as just different ways to put the resources together. So how do we combine resources? And one of the interesting questions that's going to come out of all of this self-quarantining stuff is whether or not businesses look at the ability to work virtually from home as a change in technology. Does that change the way business gets done? And if it does, then we might see a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. But the area that economists are most interested in, at least lately, is what we call institutions. Institutions are incredibly important parts of the way societies are fit together, how they're put together. Institutions are, we can think of these as the rules of the game, the rules of the way we interact with each other. So these can be social, to be sure, and they can be political, and they certainly can be economic. So how do we establish, how do we set up our society to interact with each other, to produce things, to just to go about our daily business? And research in institutions, research into the way that successful countries are set up have shown us that institutions might be more important than how many resources you have and how much technology you have. Again, we'll talk more about institutions when we get into our next chapter on economic growth, but these are some of the basic things that cause there to be economic growth. And the economic growth that we observe would be the shifting of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So that's pretty much the first of our two curves. So let's move on and take a look now at the trickier of the two curves, and that's the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run curve looks more like the supply curves you're familiar with. This is our upward sloping curve. So here is our GDP, here's our price level, and so here's what our short-run aggregate supply curve looks like, this upward sloping curve. Now the primary reason for that upward sloping curve is that prices don't all adjust completely in the short run. We say that prices are sticky. Now, in a basic market where we have just demand and supply of a particular product, so say the demand and the supply for ballpoint pens, something pretty boring. The supply curve is always upward sloping, and what we're dealing with is prices changing in order to adjust for that specific market. So prices go up and down depending on the relationship between demand and supply. But here we're talking about the entire economy, so we have to deal with prices of all kinds of different things. And not all prices are going to adjust at the same rate, and not all prices are going to adjust completely in the short period of time that we have to deal with changes, with these ups and downs in the short run. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. In most cases, what a business finds is that a cost to running their business, the costs don't change regularly. Because of contracts. Think about a job you have had in the past. You get hired, the business promises to pay you a certain amount, and that's kind of it until you get a raise. Hopefully you get a raise, or you get fired and then they don't pay you anything. But the costs of running the business are typically set up like that. So whether it is you pay your electric bill and you have a certain rate at which you pay for a certain period of time, you pay your employees a certain rate for a particular period of time, and those prices that you pay for your inputs, and so we could consider costs the prices paid for inputs, those don't change regularly. But the prices that you charge for the goods that you sell, we could call those output. Those output prices, they do change fairly regularly. You don't have a contract with the gasoline that you sell. You're selling the product to a consumer, and you don't have a contract with the consumer. They come by if they need gasoline, and the price is $1.95, or if the price is $2.95, they can choose to buy that or not. There's no contract. So here is a car coming by the gas station. The gas station, there's the gas pump. Now there's the thing that tells you how much you're paying. And so you get out and you're like, well, there's the price of gas. And we'll just say it's $1.95. So there's the price of gas, and you pay that. And then the next day you drive by, and the price of gas is not $1.95 anymore. Maybe it's $1.90. So the price has changed pretty considerably from one day to the next. But here's the person who works in the little shop, in the convenience shop. So here's this person, and they are getting paid, say, $8.75 an hour. And they get paid $8.75 an hour today, and they get paid $8.75 an hour tomorrow. Even though the price of gasoline has changed. So this is what we're talking about with prices being sticky. Some prices, typically input prices, are sticky. And they don't change quickly, whereas output prices, they change a lot. These are not sticky prices. So as the price goes up for the output, so if the price of the output goes up, we know that the quantity supplied is going to go up. And now one of the additional reasons for that is because your input costs stay the same. So the firms want to increase their output because now they can make more profit per unit sold because they're collecting more in revenue where their costs stay the same. And if the price of the output goes down, then the quantity supplied is going to go down because now it's a little bit harder to cover the cost of those fixed inputs because those input prices aren't sticky. If the price of gasoline goes down, people at the get-go don't have lower paychecks unless get-go reduces their hours. So if the price of output goes down, the quantity supplied is going to go down because it's harder to cover those input prices that are sticky. Okay, so let me tell you a little story here about sticky prices. One of the stickiest prices ever was the price of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, when it started out, was just a fountain drink. What happened was Coca-Cola would sell the soda syrup to drugstores and soda fountains across the country, and the people at the soda fountains would mix it with carbonated water. And so that's how Coca-Cola made their money. They made their money selling syrup to these soda fountains. Well, a couple of guys came into the office one day, asked to speak to the president of Coca-Cola because they had a bright idea. They wanted to put Coke in bottles and sell it. Now, the president of Coca-Cola thought these two guys were crazy. And as a result of that, he made what is perhaps the worst business decision ever made in the history of business. He wrote up a contract that said these guys could buy the syrup from Coca-Cola at a fixed price in perpetuity, which means forever. There would never be a change in the price of the syrup that the Coca-Cola company sold to these bottlers. The bottlers walk out of the office thinking they've just made the greatest move in the history of the world. And the president of Coca-Cola kind of sloughed it off and said, these guys have no hope. No one would ever want to drink Coca-Cola out of a bottle. Well, a few years go by and Coca-Cola realizes that people do want to buy Coca-Cola out of a bottle. And they are not really making a whole lot of money. They're selling syrup to these bottlers, to be sure, but it's not really making Coca-Cola a lot of money. In fact, a lot of the soda fountains and the drugstores that were selling Coca-Cola over the counter, essentially, weren't doing that anymore. They were selling Coca-Cola out of bottles. So the Coca-Cola company called up the bottlers. They had a meeting. They said, hey, let's renegotiate this contract. And the bottlers, being wise businessmen, said, absolutely not. This is great for us. Which put Coca-Cola in a bind. Really, the only way they can make money was to sell more syrup. And to sell more syrup, they needed to make sure that the price of Coca-Cola stayed low. So they started one of the best advertising campaigns in the history of advertising. So after making one of the worst decisions in the history of business, they made one of the best marketing decisions ever. And that was to essentially plaster the world with advertisements that said Coca-Cola was 5 cents. You may have seen old advertising pictures or old advertising merchandise of Coca-Cola that says Coca-Cola 5 cents. So Coca-Cola always 5 cents. And so everybody around the country and even around the world started to believe and expect that Coca-Cola would always and only be 5 cents. The price of Coca-Cola syrup was sticky, and now the price of the bottle of Coca-Cola was going to be really, really sticky. There was no adjustment, essentially, in the price of Coca-Cola for almost 70 years. The price never changed. So the bottlers realized this is really bad for us. We can't afford to produce Coca-Cola at 5 cents a bottle. And that's what really brought Coca-Cola and the bottlers of Coca-Cola, who were now two different companies, that really brought them together and said, look, we've got to do something about this. The stickiness of these prices is killing both of us. Now, there were, of course, attempts to fix that problem. The Coca-Cola bottlers tried to get vending machines to accept more than 1 nickel for a Coke, but the vending machines were pretty lousy and they couldn't do that. If you put a dime in, the dime just didn't do anything. The machines were so low tech. At one point, the bottlers of Coca-Cola attempted to persuade the President of the United States, at the time Dwight Eisenhower, to coin a new, or to mint a new coin, a 7.5 cent coin that would be the same size as a nickel, so that the vending machines could actually accept a higher price. And Eisenhower said, "Hey, you guys are nuts, get out of here." So what caused this change? What caused the stickiness of prices to evaporate? Well, basically inflation. Because the price of producing Coca-Cola was going up and the price that they could charge for their output wasn't going up, the bottlers said, we got to do something about this. And they renegotiated the contract with Coca-Cola. Well, kids, that's the story of the stickiest price in history. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about here what causes the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift, and then put all these things together. Because one of the things that we're seeing in the world right now is some significant economic upheaval, and we can use this model, once we put all the pieces together, to understand what that means for us. So here are our short-run aggregate supply shifters. When we talk about short-run shifters, we tend to call these things shocks, because usually the things that cause a short-run aggregate supply curve to shift is something of a surprise. It's something you did not see coming. These are surprise events that affect the firm's production costs. So it's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that, and now my costs go up. Or whoa, I wasn't expecting this, and now my costs go down. Shocks typically revolve around a couple of different things. One of the types of shocks that we see with some degree of frequency involves the weather. So whether there is a drought or something like a couple years ago we had the polar vortex that was like these intense and long periods of sub-freezing temperatures, and vehicles just wouldn't function, and businesses couldn't operate because it was just too cold. So that would be a shock, and it changes how much gets supplied for a short period of time, and then the weather changes and we get back to normal. So weather is one of the more common shocks that we would talk about. Oil shocks actually are another, and we're kind of going through an oil shock period right now. Saudi Arabia and Russia are having this big dispute over how much oil to supply in the market, and Saudi Arabia wasn't happy with the negotiations with Russia, so they basically said, we're going to turn on the faucets and we're just going to flood the market with oil until you see the errors of your ways. Russia and Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East, and now America too, have a pretty good control on how much oil there is in the world market. And the more oil there is, the lower the price. So right now, we're experiencing an oil price shock in a good way for consumers. As the amount of oil in the market increases, the price drops. And anything that needs oil in the production process, whether it's shipping, whether it's to make plastics, whether it's just to keep the gears lubricated, as those prices drop, it makes for a good for good business environments, because now that's a cost that you don't have to worry about. Now the price of oil will probably go up in the future, and this temporary short-run positive oil supply shock will go away, just like the weather conditions change. Another short-run aggregate supply shock would be terrorism. Most countries that have experienced terrorism have an immediate short-run shift in their aggregate supply curves. But it tends to only be short-run. Even if you go back to September 11 in 2001, in the United States, we saw this reduction in production, which was a decrease in GDP, but it didn't last very long. And we see this happen in other parts of the world, whether it's France, whether it's Germany, wherever the terrorism occurs. We see that there's a temporary short change in supply, but for the most part, people get back to normal. Now, of course, we are dealing with the coronavirus. And this has provided a supply shock of, I guess you could say, of unimaginable magnitude. This is really kind of a big deal. If you go out in the, just take a drive around and you see all the businesses that are closed, and if you read the papers or look online and see what's not happening, this is a pretty significant change in the economy. So I want to talk a little bit more about this in the context of the overall economy, but for now, we're just going to kind of back off on the virus talk. Put one more supply shifter, short-run supply shifter on our list, and that is policy. Policymakers, as we'll talk about, can use their policy tools to alter a short-run aggregate supply. So these are our supply shifters, our short-run supply shifters, and let me just kind of wrap up by this part of the material by showing you what that looks like. So again, we have GDP on our horizontal axis, we have price level up here. And if we have our short-run aggregate supply curve, and we experience a supply shock, a supply shock that's good for business would shift the curve to the right. So we'll just call that short-run aggregate supply curve 2. This is an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So we'll do that in green down here. And an increase is a positive shock. Something that changes the ability to produce things. Typically, it reduces the cost of doing business. So that oil supply shock, that's a positive shock for business. The other change, or the other direction we could go, would be to the left. And this would be our short-run aggregate supply. We'll call that 3. That shift to the left is a decrease in aggregate supply, and this is a result of a negative supply shock. And that's clearly what's going on with the coronavirus. It's a negative supply shock. There's less being produced. So now that we have the pieces, let's put all this stuff together to see if we can understand where we're headed, or where we should expect to be headed in our macro economy, based on the thing that's interfering with our lives and the reason why you're watching this on your computer screen and not in front of a classroom. And that is, of course, the coronavirus. Okay, so we're going to put our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model together. But all the pieces that we have are our aggregate demand, our aggregate supplies, both of them. So again, we have GDP down here, we have the price level up here. And so let's put in place just the basic components here first. So here's the short run aggregate supply curve. Here's the aggregate demand curve. And in an economy where everything is kind of basically balanced out, where we are in long run equilibrium, what we're going to have is the economy in equilibrium where all three of those lines cross. And where all three of those lines cross, we are at the natural rate of output, that Y star, and remember that is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. So everything is right with the world here. Everything is in equilibrium. This economy moves towards that equilibrium point where we have the natural rate of output. And if prices are somehow higher or lower than our equilibrium price, so this is going to be right here, we'll just call that P star, just to keep the stars together. If we're at a different price other than that P star, the economy is going to work to move us back to that position. So for example, let's say we are, let's say we're up here at a higher price. So we'll call that PH for high price. If we have a high price, well, at that point, the quantity supplied, which is found on the supply curve, it exceeds the quantity demanded. And in order to clear that surplus of production, the price has to go down. This is just like what we saw with the normal market. If firms across the economy are producing too much for what consumers want, there's going to be downward pressure on price so that we move along the respective curves until we get to our equilibrium point. Similarly, if we are at a price that is too low, let's go with this. If we're down here and the price is too low, then the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded and there's a shortage. And that's going to put upward pressure on price to move us along the respective curves until we get back to equilibrium. So even in the macro world, when things need to adjust, the adjustment happens through the price level. Maybe not every price goes up if the price overall is too low, but enough of them will to force that price up. And if the price is too high, it might be that not every price goes down, but enough of them will to lower the overall price level. So that's where we start. What we see here is a world in which we are at the natural rate of output, we have the natural rate of unemployment, and prices are stable at equilibrium. So everything's kind of in a good place right now. So how do things change, or how can we interpret changes in the economy if something alters this equilibrium? Let's start off with a pretty easy example, and one that's for policymakers kind of the typical thing that they are reacting to. As people lose their jobs, and people are starting to lose their jobs as a result of this coronavirus, that's going to cause incomes to fall. And as income falls, that causes us to experience a demand shift, an aggregate demand shift. So let's see what we should predict in our economy as a result of these kind of changes. So we're going to start off with our aggregate demand curve. Here's our short-run aggregate supply curve. And here is our long-run aggregate supply curve right there. Okay, so we start off at equilibrium here. Here's P star. Here is Y star. So we are in equilibrium, and then people's incomes go down. Now, because we're dealing with changes in income, that's going to be a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So here we are. Here's our new aggregate demand curve. So let me put a couple of labels here. This first place where we start, we're going to call that A. That's our initial equilibrium. When people's incomes fall, that shifts the aggregate demand curve, and it moves us to this point right here. And notice what that is. There we go. That gives us a new price and a new output. But notice where those prices and outputs are relative to where we started. Here we see that prices are going down, but output is going down. And if output goes down, that means that unemployment is going up. There's more unemployment. Or you could think about it this way: employment is going down. So as we move away from the natural rate of output, we're also moving away from the natural rate of unemployment. That's terrible. This situation, what we see right here, is the short-run fluctuation, the short-run business cycle version of a recession. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, unemployment goes up, output goes down, price levels go down, and we have, yay, a recession. Well, maybe not yay, but that's what's happening. That's what most recessions look like. So, how do we return to the long run? The long run's out there, and all we have seen here are changes in price levels in the short run. Not all prices are adjusting. Some of them have, but not all of them have. Eventually, all prices will adjust. And as a result of that, we should see some movement back to the long-run equilibrium. So let's leave this graph up here and see if we can follow along with how we might get back to the long-run equilibrium from where we currently find ourselves. Part of that plan might involve letting the markets do their thing, just letting markets adjust. And so one of the things we could do to restore the long-run equilibrium would be to do nothing. We could just say, I'm not doing anything. I'm going to let the market figure this out. So we started at point A, and we go to this green dot. We're going to call that point B. And what we want to do is get back to the equilibrium, get back to that blue long-run aggregate supply curve. So how do we do that? Well, if we do nothing, what should happen is that people will adjust to the now lower prices. So people who are out of work say to themselves, well, I need a job eventually, and because prices across the economy are less, now I'm willing to take a smaller paycheck. So you accept the lower pay, So if workers take less pay just to get a job, then this is going to cause a decrease in the costs to business. And if we decrease the costs to doing business, well, guess what? That's going to cause our short-run aggregate supply curve to increase. It's going to cause that short-run curve to shift to the right, just like this. And so that moves us to a new equilibrium point, new relative to B. But that new equilibrium point, we're going to call that point C, that's on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So we are back to Y star. So output increases, unemployment falls, and the only difference between A and C is the price level. So that's really a picture of how the long run and the short run differ from each other. I mentioned the idea of in the long run, it really doesn't matter what the price is. The only thing that we're looking for is to be at that natural rate of output. So A and C are both at the same output level. A and C are both at the same unemployment level, but we just have different prices. So that's one way that the economy could change. Just step back, don't do anything, and let the economy adjust itself. However, that's incredibly unlikely to happen. Politicians don't want to wait for changes, and people don't want to wait for changes. This process doesn't happen overnight. This process could take months or even years to happen. So we could get back to equilibrium, but we do so at the expense of perhaps long stretches of unemployment, which is really, really kind of a hard thing to deal with. So we have the policymakers step in. And if you remember, these policy recommendations are brought to you by John Maynard Keynes. That guy I've talked about a couple times now. Keynes said, look, all that adjustment that you're suggesting, that's fine. But it's not what people need. People need things to change more quickly. So, Keynes comes along and says, hey, if this is the situation, and we have long-run aggregate supply, and we have short-run aggregate supply, and we have an aggregate demand curve here, and then again, here's our original equilibrium point, right where all those lines cross, and our aggregate demand curve has shifted left so that output has fallen and people are hurting, people are out of work. Well, let's just do this. So we'll start at A, we go to B. Let's use policy to shift that aggregate demand curve, because remember, part of policy is government spending. So Keynes says, let's use policy to shift that curve. So if people are losing jobs, one of the policy recommendations that you might have heard is that the government's just going to start cutting checks to people and saying, hey, here's some money, go spend it. And if that's what happens, then that could shift the aggregate demand curve back where it came from. In fact, that's what Keynesian policy is really all about. Keynesian policy is designed to shift aggregate demand. So let me specify this here. This is Keynesian policy. This is not all policy, but this is most policy that we see in our world today. We see that Keynesian policy is designed to shift the aggregate demand curve. That's what it's good at. And so if we could shift this curve through, say, increased government spending to counteract the business cycle, or by cutting taxes so that people have more income, or just by sending people checks then that should increase aggregate demand and move it back to, well, hopefully point A. So we start at A, we move to B during the recession, and then the recovery inspired by policy shifts the curve back to A, or shifts the curve back to the original aggregate demand curve and shifts our equilibrium back to A. So that's what policy is supposed to do, at least when there's changes in aggregate demand. Okay, so now let's take a look at what economists are concerned about when it comes to this coronavirus. Let's set up our graph just like we've had it. Now we've got real GDP here, got our price levels up here, and so here is our long-run aggregate supply curve. Here is our short-run aggregate supply curve, and here is aggregate demand. As businesses are closing and as the costs, so as businesses close in response to the coronavirus, as restaurants shut down, as manufacturing shuts down, as some construction shuts down, that is going to clearly change the ability of firms across the economy to produce. So that's going to change our short-run aggregate supply curve, and hopefully that causes the curve to shift only in the short run. So there's our new short-run aggregate supply curve. So what does that mean for the economy as a whole? Well, we now have a new equilibrium point, at least a short-run equilibrium point right here. So if we drop that point down and compare it to our natural rate of output, we see that output is falling, which means real GDP is falling. Again, that's kind of the definition of a recession. We see output fall, and when output falls, unemployment rises. We should see in the next few weeks, when unemployment data is released, we should see unemployment rates go up and maybe go up substantially. Output's going to fall, GDP is going to be lower. And what we might expect to see, if this is the only change in the economy, we would expect to see that price levels go up as well. This is the worst case possible scenario for an economy. Output going down, unemployment going up, and price levels rising. This sort of unholy trinity of bad economic news is sometimes called a stagflation. It's not just inflation, it's stagflation, where your economy is stagnating and you have inflation. This is a horrible, horrible situation to find yourselves in. This is kind of like output falling and unemployment going up, and whatever toilet paper is in the stores is now way more expensive than it used to be. That's stagflation. So this is really bad. This is sort of worst possible case scenario. Now, of course, this presumes that there's only one change in the economy at a time. As we saw a couple slides ago, it could be that aggregate demand falls as well. And if aggregate demand falls, then that would put us here, or could put us here. So maybe prices don't rise, but output falls and unemployment rises a lot more than we expected. So that's pretty bad too. And that leads us to the question of what should be done to fix this economy. What can be done? What should policymakers be doing? Policymakers have some tools at their disposal, they don't have a ton. As you may have heard in the news, uh, people are looking to the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, to change monetary policy. And so that is a possibility, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a couple of weeks. Politicians are also talking about changes to the tax code, and that's another policy tool that the government has in order to try to stimulate economic activity. They could change taxes for households. They could send us checks that would affect the aggregate demand side. They could also change tax policy for businesses. And if they change tax policy for businesses, that's going to affect the aggregate supply side. So where does that put us? Well, right now the economy is kind of in a mess. And how long will it last? Well, we're not sure about that. Hopefully this is a short-run phenomenon and it doesn't lead to a long-run shift in the aggregate supply curve, because if it does, that's going to be a bad shift. That's probably going to be a shift to the left, and that is something that we don't want to experience. That's a permanent decrease in our ability to produce. Presuming this is a short-run aggregate supply shift, an aggregate supply shock, and it most likely is, policymakers are going to find it really difficult to pass good policy that's going to achieve the objectives that they want to achieve, simply because there's too many targets to hit. There's too many moving pieces. There's aggregate demand shifts, there's aggregate supply shifts. So does that mean they should sit back and do nothing? That's probably not going to happen. So it's probably not even worth considering. If they were to do nothing, of course, politically speaking, that would be very problematic for them. They want to be seen as helping to fix the problem. The question becomes whether or not the solutions that they offer solve the problem or create more problems of their own. You see, with policy, there are often unintended consequences that accompany that policy. We'll talk more about unintended consequences in policymaking in a couple weeks. But for now, you've got some of the background, some of the same background that policymakers are utilizing today to try to figure out what in the world's going to happen with this coronavirus. What in the world is going to happen to our economy as a result of this really unexpected short-run supply shock. So you can use the tools that we've developed here to follow along at home, if you will, to see what policymakers are reacting to and to try to understand what the policies are intending to accomplish. And hopefully you'll be able to follow this right to the end, where we have a legitimate outcome, a legitimate beneficial solution. Well, sounds like my phone's ringing. I better go. We'll get back to you next week with more on economic growth.